The winter was harsh for all of us. Food was scarce in the best of times, and this year the soil had been anything but generous. My uncle's farm was small at the time, sitting on the outskirts of town, deep within the woods. Our cow, Petra, had grown old, and was no longer able to produce milk. We debated slaughtering her as the winter went on, the bitter cold coming down from the mountains, strangling our crops and sowing darkness into the skies, though, hungry as we were, we never found the desperation required to kill the poor girl. My uncle saw it coming, of course. Said he could hear ill whispers on the wind, like the world was sick. He'd sit by the fire, his false leg propped up against his old rocking chair, rubbing his elbow with the thick, calloused fingers of a farmer. He'd talk about his bones, how they'd ache and creak before a particularly brutal winter, how the whispers in his arms would keep him up at night, calling his name. We were so few that year, so tired. The winter had brought with it a vicious fever, never quite reaching our farm, but devastating the nearby town, the dead strewn about the streets, tossed away by families too fearful of disease to bury them properly. I had never seen a dead man before. I was only 14. It was a Sunday when the wise men came. Uncle Jim wasn't the church-going type, claiming that he preferred the shapes in the woods, that they were more generous. And so I sat alone in the creamy dead grass of the churchyard, waiting in my black Sunday dress for the monotonous sound of church bells to signal the beginning of Mass. There were no church bells that day. Instead, there was singing. They were 3 in number, dancing through the streets in their thick, scarlet robes, hiding wonders in their flesh, singing their song as they went. Little Sebastian, the elder son, had heard the commotion from his window. On that day, like most days for Sebastian, he had been reading, lost in the pages of some fantasy story plucked from his father's library. From his window, he heard the busy chaos of the town center, the swirling masses gathered around 3 tall figures that Sebastian had never seen before. As all children do, Sebastian had a secret place, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts, where he could stare into the night sky and wonder at the glittering lights above. For Sebastian, that place was the roof, a little intersection of sun-bleached shingles that stood directly over his room. Opening his window, Sebastian stumbled onto his windowsill, little feet scrambling up rusty pipes and crumbling brickwork. He climbed, mind ablaze with a curiosity that could only be satisfied by an eagle-eye view of the crowd below, the nectar-sweet song of the 3 wise men dancing in his head as he ascended. Sebastian made no noise when he fell. The dull thud of his skull cracking against the pavement was drowned out by the effervescent voices of the wise men, miracles flowing like rivers from their mouths. When the screams did begin, however, they offered only silence. And then they laughed. Like a wisp of smoke they came, swirling and dancing through the crowd, a sharp, almost angry laughter on their lips. They approached Sebastian's shattered form, still laughing, scarlet arms outstretched towards the sun. A thick silence descended upon the crowd, and slowly they began to peel off their robes. I am an old woman now. My memory is foggy and fractured, and every day it grows even more so. Every day I feel little details slipping away, but those screams I will never forget. I watched as the wise men removed their robes. I saw the mouths growing and screaming on their arms and their legs, drooling void and salt water onto that boy's body, filthy tongues lapping at the blood-soaked brickwork. They were praying, screaming the ineffable names of the skies. The firmament opened. Everything old, suddenly new, the mad laughter of angels riding the backs of the clouds in the sunlight, and then Sebastian stood. There were gasps from the crowd. Some fled, others fell to their knees in prayer, but Sebastian just wept, tears of blood streaming down his cheeks. Slowly, gracefully, They moved through our town, miracles flowing like rivers from their mouths. They sang to the wind, opening the sky before our eyes, peeling back the firmament and showering grace down from above. They sang to the mountains, opening up the earth and holding back the bitter cold of winter. They sang to the soil, freeing our crops from the dirt and filling our homes with food. With voices like fire, they blessed us. They told us secrets known only to the mad, secrets that brought wealth and prosperity, secrets that could extend life and teach men to speak with the stars above. Willingly, we worshipped them. We offered them gifts of gold and silver, and in return, they would heal our sick and raise our dead. If there were any doubt from the council, it was quickly silenced at Sebastian's name, the elder himself venerating the wise men as heroes to the people. Even I, in my young naivety, found myself in awe of their work, waking up early every morning to hear them speak in the town square. My uncle was less impressed, said making a dead man walk was nothing he hadn't seen before. And then they brought us horrors. Uncle Jim saw it first, woken up in the early morning hours to the sound of weeping from the other side of his window. Peeling back the blinds, there stood Petra, blithering and wailing in the voice of a man, begging for death. "It's a warning," he told me the following morning, a mug of black coffee clutched tightly in both hands. I knew they'd come for us eventually, though I'd hoped that day wouldn't come for a very long time. He looked deep into my eyes as he said this, that old Jim Cranor smile gone, replaced by a look of sadness, and beyond that, there was fear. My uncle's family had been farming on this land for 4 generations. My great-grandfather had greeted the first men and women that would eventually settle the little town next door, offering to teach them the ways of his father before him, show the newcomers how to please the gods that lived in the woods. He taught them the old rites, how to speak to the trees and how to listen to the soil. I never knew much about my great-great-grandfather, but I know that he did something evil. So evil that the church stuck him on a ship for the New World, escorted by a skeleton crew with deep pockets, armed to the teeth. They were instructed to make port and march him into the wilderness. 3 days without rest, and to never take their eyes off him or unshackle him for any reason. His chains were to be inscribed with the prayers of Pope Leo XIII. All his teeth were to be plucked from his mouth and carried in the pockets of his guardsmen. After his deliverance, the men were warned to never leave home without my great-great-grandfather's teeth in their pockets. My uncle refused to go into any more detail, but I know for a fact that my great-great-grandfather got his teeth back. Every one of them. However, I do know how my great-great-grandfather died. When I was growing up, my uncle warned me to never set foot in the woods south of the farm. He told me that our bloodline was cursed by the god that lives in those woods, that my great-great-grandfather had deceived it into giving him its tongue. He had planted the tongue into our soil, and from it grew a mighty tree of flesh, its branches carving curses into the sky, forever banishing the Christian god from this land. Furious, the forest god returned to my great-great-grandfather, dragging him screaming and laughing into the woods. We buried Petra out behind the barn, the old girl still screaming, even after taking 2 slugs to the head, even after the dirt was piled over her. Uncle Jim sat on a haystack, cigarette burning on his lips, and a concerned look in his eye. He seemed detached, almost afraid, but Uncle Jim was never afraid. He sent me back to the farmhouse once I'd finished filling in Petra's grave, told me he had work to do, and that I wasn't ready to see what happened next. So, I waited, staring out my window until dawn, seeing the lights and listening to the voices that bled from within the barn. He didn't return until sunrise. "Are we safe?" I asked him as he stumbled through the door. "Nope," he mumbled, taking a seat in his rocking chair and unfastening his false leg. "Do we need to leave?" "Nowhere to go," he replied. "Storm's brewing. Best to ride it out." "They're going to come for us, aren't they?" I said. "For me alone, I reckon," he replied, hands rubbing his sore elbow. "You haven't seen what I've seen yet. Not a spot of sin on you. No, I figure hell just gonna find me earlier than most Cranors. That is, if they can drag me there themselves, of course. I'm old, but I'm not helpless. Not one bit." "Let me help you," I begged. "Hell no. Little girl like you just piss 'em off. Those things, you're a bug to them. Less, even. Hell, even your great-great-granddaddy'd be scared of them. No, best for you to just hide. Out of sight, out of mind." "Where?" I asked. "Come on, I'll show you." Uncle Jim fastened his leg into place and guided me through the front doors, the night cold and sharp, nipping at my skin. We walked out into the field, out where we grew nothing and the grass turned obsidian black in the moonlight. It was sacred ground, he'd tell me, said that nothing grown from this soil had any business up here. We came about halfway across the field and stopped, Uncle Jim staring deep into the skies. "Take off your shoes now, Abigail," he said. "This here's hollowed ground." I did, feeling the strange black grass under my toes, moving and shifting in the wind. My uncle smiled, proud of the girl he'd raised. He spit into his right hand and placed it onto my forehead. For a moment, I could feel it. The earth's stomach and the mouths that grew within, speaking to the earth, to the plants. Their voices moved within me, like bed bugs shifting in my skin. I opened my eyes, and there it was, as it had always been. The tree my great-great-grandfather had planted, its tongues that endlessly blasphemed the stars and the moon. The Cranor family tree in all its glory. Uncle Jim reached out a hand, the tree bending and twisting down to meet him. He pulled, the tree shrieking in pain, and with a great wet snap he tore a branch from its limbs, the tongue thrashing and wiggling about in his hands. "Now you listen here, Abigail," he said, cradling the tongue as one would an infant. "This tongue is special. From it came words, and from those words there came a hole, a great blind spot in the eye of God. He hates us Cranors, you know, hates our blood, every drop leading all the way back to your great-great-grandfather Solomon. You see, Solomon Cranor knew things, knew how to grow mouths in the stomachs of clergymen, where to find the burial places of angels and kings. So many things your great-great-grandfather knew, and this knowledge greatly displeased God. For years, all of heaven would pursue him, through every corner of the earth, and for years, Solomon Cranor would get away, until the day he decided to settle down here. Now, I've suspected that the man upstairs would send someone eventually. I'd only hoped it'd be long after you've been dead and gone, but it's too late for that now. I need you to remember what I've taught you, and when this here tongue is ready and it crawls down your throat while you sleep, I want you to settle down, just like your great-great-grandfather." He embraced me, and for a while we just stood in the shadow of the great writhing tree, me crying into his faded overalls, and him running his fingers through my hair. They came not long after sunset. There was old Duke with his shotgun, and Elder Thomas with a newborn lamb in his arms. The pair were followed by 4 others that I didn't recognize, all armed with rope and chains. A thin smile etched into each of their faces. I watched on from the tree line, my uncle's tongue wrapped in blankets, clutched tightly in my arms. Uncle Jim simply stood, the Cranor tree writhing behind him. "Jim Cranor," Elder Thomas called. "The prophets have told us about you, told us who you really are and why you're here. We know you brought the fever to our town. We know you placed a blight on our crops. They want us to bring you to them, so why not make it easier on all of us and just come along now?" Uncle Jim grinned at this, the kind of big toothy grin that only he was capable of. "Now I never liked you much, Thomas, but I never thought you to be a foolish man. Not till today, that is." Anger flashed over Elder Thomas's face. He ran his blade across the lamb's throat, letting its blood hit the soil, and the little thing squirmed and gargled and finally went still in his arms. He laid the lamb down on the grass. Uncle Jim just watched on, smiling. For a moment, all was quiet, and then the lamb began to shake. The shaking grew more and more violent, the lamb moaning in pain and agony. There was a shifting in its body, a movement, a sound, the tearing of meat and the snapping of bones, crimson soaking into the grass and the soil. The thing that burst from the lamb's stomach moved faster than any of the men could see, moving snake-like through the grass and leaping into the air, latching itself onto Uncle Jim's throat, tearing it to bloodied ribbons. He stumbled, droplets of crimson dribbling down his overalls, and in a single motion my uncle raised his hands to the sky. Behind him, the old Cranor family tree began to shake. There was a sound, deep and wide like an ocean, and it filled the air and the earth beneath my feet. I turned and ran into the woods then, and I did not stop until the sun crested overhead, cutting its way through the overcast skies, ignoring the screams that followed me as I fled. It has been many years since that day. My uncle was brave to rebel against the wise men and their followers, though conflict was never our family's way. We survived all these years by turning away the eye of the Almighty, not by shouting him down from the heavens. I can still hear Uncle Jim sometimes, his deep, barrel-chested laughter on the wind, in the trees and the air around me. I know not what became of our old farm or the little town near it, though I've heard stories. Stories of God Almighty reaching down and plucking the little town up from the dirt, carrying it screaming off into the heavens. I still keep with me the tongue torn from the Cranor family tree. One day, I will plant it in the soil, just like my great-great-grandfather, and I'll watch it spit curses into the skies until my final days.